Dear students, dear colleagues, dear friends, it is a great pleasure to have all of you today here. I am the Dean of Venice International University. My name is Agar Brugiavini. Many of you met me during these days, but I hope in the future I will be, I will be around and have a chance to meet all of you, especially the students. I'm really glad to see so many representatives from the partner universities, and I want to call them my professors in the sense that they are the professors of VIU while they're here. So I want to greet all the professors from Boston College, from LMU, from Waseda University, from Tel Aviv University, but also from Ca' Foscari, from Padua University, from UAV, and of course from the European University at St. Petersburg. And as you will see, VIU is such a broad and such a wide consortium of universities that we cover really from the Far East to the Far West. So I want to give you a little overview of what we do at Venice International University to the benefit of the students and to the benefit of those who are first time here with us. So this is a view of the island. And here you can see where we are. We are, you see, in that little red square in the lagoon of Venice. And that tells you a long story. I mean, we are deep into the lagoon, and many of the activities that we carry out have to do with our environment, with the place we live in. You can also see that Venice has the shape of a fish, and I'm sure many of you students will have the opportunity to go around, to visit, to take pictures, and to enjoy the urban environment and the lagoon. We organize many, many activities to have you become acquainted with the city and with the lagoon. As I said, VIU is a very unique experience, a very unique entity. You see, we go from, Duke University, Boston College, Canada, INRS, to the European universities like Lausanne, Ludwig Maximilian, but then Padua, of course, and Ca' Foscari. But then we also go to the Far East with Waseda University, Tsinghua, Tongji, and we also have Tel Aviv University. So this gives you the true nature, this representation gives you the true nature of VIU, which is a truly international experience. So if one of you was visiting, say, one university in France, in Paris, would be exposed to many French students, and that would be good because you would learn more French probably. But here, as you could already experience, you have students from all over the world. So you can exchange culture, exchange points of view, and that's the strength of this experience at VIU. You see that we have a very specific mission to enhance the relationship across our partner universities, and the universities are what? They are students, professors, research. So that's what we are trying to do together. And the themes which are very dear to us are the global issues, sustainability, cultural heritage, design management, aging and welfare, contemporary art. So you see a very wide spectrum of topics that we are investigating and we're interested in. But what is very, very important at VIU is a new methodology, because we are forced, and that's becoming our challenge, and it has become over the years our challenge, to have an interdisciplinary and an intercultural approach. And you will see as you go along how important this is in your studies. VIU is organized into academic programs, which are fall term, spring term, and summer term. You are now in the spring term. But we also have advanced learning and research programs taking place here at VIU. And many of you will have the opportunity to come to contact with our research activities during the year. And then we have several VIU seminars and other activities that you're all invited to attend, because they are opportunities that you should exploit as we go along. So the Globalization Program has 2 terms. The full term is it is devoted more to cultural heritage in a broad sense, whereas the spring term, which is the one we are just starting, is more of a sustainable development and sustainable life, let's say, type of approach. Our professors are all speaking English, so it's exactly for making sure that there is the widest participation as possible. We have many multicultural, there is a large supply of multicultural events and multicultural opportunities. And as I said, you know, the main themes are Venice and Italy, because you are in Venice and you are in Italy and you should take the opportunity to learn about this, but also cultures of the world and global challenges. So these are the themes you're going to cover this term too. We are part of many large networks. I don't want to mention all of them. You have a glimpse here of all the relationships that we have established over the years. And a lot of partners with, of course, the Municipality of Venice, the Province of Venice, which is hosting us on the island. So I'm very grateful, and I want to greet the Province of Venice, who is also our partner, and the Veneto region and the Venice Biennale. In fact, the Venice Biennale is also an important partnership, and it gives you a lot of opportunities for stage and internship and so on. So before I close this, let me say that you should use this time to learn, to enjoy yourself, to learn about Venice, to learn about Italy, and we will accompany you into this process, into this development. Do not hesitate to ask any of us. You met already our wonderful staff. I don't need to name all of them, but for any problems, you just can refer to them. So I just want to finish wishing you a lot of good things during this time. So let me now move to today's lecture. Today we are extremely pleased to have with us a very distinguished professor from University College London. Paul Ekins is the director of the UCL Institute for Sustainable Resources, University College London. He's also an academic who is focusing his research, who has been focusing his research on the conditions and policies to achieve environmentally sustainable economy. So you see that it's exactly on target as far as our topics are concerned, our research issues are concerned. The areas of research of Professor Ekins are energy, environment, economy, interaction, environmental policies, resource productivity, sustainable energy use, modeling scenarios. So Professor Ekins is ranging from very technical, very detailed research to a much more policy-oriented research. And that's exactly the type of research we need nowadays if we want to make sure that, you know, what we learn from science becomes then policy, becomes everyday life. He's also Deputy Director of the UK Energy Research Centre. He's a Fellow of the Energy Institute, a Senior Consultant to Cambridge Econometrics, a Co-Director of the UK Energy Research Centre, and is leading the UCL participation in the EPCRS SuperGAN consortium on hydrogen, fuel cells, and bioenergy research. So it's a long list of things that is involved in, and I'm just going to leave the floor to Paul Ekins. Thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you, Dean, for that very kind introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you to VIU for inviting me to this beautiful place to give my first ever Lectio Magistralis, which is a very great privilege. It's also a challenge because I know that you come from not just many different countries, but many different disciplines. And my background academically is as an engineer first, electrical engineer, and then an economist. As the Dean said, I do some quite technical research, but also focus on policy. And my theme today is energy and climate change. And I've chosen that because, as I hope will become clear, 2015 is a very critical year for this whole area. And I was very pleased to see that energy and climate change issues and sustainable development more broadly are fundamental parts of the course which you will be studying this semester, and I hope for the rest of your lives. I have a lot of slides and not very much time. There will be more detail on the slides than I can cover. I understand the slides will be available to you, so if you see things which then flash by too quickly, I hope that you may then feel you can go back and have a look at some of the detail that I won't have been able to explain. Because in policy, the devil is always in the detail. It is easy to design broad policies that seem to be fine, but then when you actually get to implement them in the complexities of the real world, things are not as easy as they seem. So, I have 5 main parts to what I'm going to say. I shall start off just by sketching out what the global challenges of energy and climate change are. I'll then talk about some of the possible developments in the global energy system, how policies are being formulated to respond to those, concentrating mainly on the policies of the European Union, but many of those policies are applicable elsewhere, as I will try to make clear. I then enter my own real disciplinary territory, talking about the economic implications of those policies. What will it do to economic growth, for example? And then I will have some final conclusions. So it is a long and complicated journey we're going on, and I will try to take you all with me. So, pretty well all countries have these 3 basic objectives for energy policy. 2 of them are quite old: energy security and affordability. We've all been interested in getting access to the energy we need at an affordable cost. The 3rd one, of course, is more recent: a recognition that the climate is changing, that humans are changing the climate, and the principal cause of that change are the gases that we are putting in the atmosphere. And the prognosis for that from the science is very serious. It is likely to affect the lives of everybody in this room who is less than 50 years of age in a dramatic way, and indeed it is already affecting many people's lives in a dramatic way. And it is a subject, an issue to which the global community needs to find a response. And I will go through some of the elements of that response in the lecture. So, transition to a low-carbon energy system, increase security and resilience of the energy system while we make that transition, while at the same time trying to ensure that people and businesses can remain competitive and people can remain able to buy the energy they need for their energy services. This is the only slide on energy security, and I'm going to jump over it quite quickly. There are 2 concerns about energy security. Do we have the infrastructure in our own countries to deliver the energy services that people need? And will we have access to the energy resources that are outside our borders in order to generate the various forms of energy that we need for these services? Most people concentrate on the second one, and there's widespread talk about geopolitical problems and geopolitical disturbances because, of course, fossil fuels are very unequally distributed around the world. But actually, if you look at the evidence, when the lights go out, normally it's because of domestic infrastructure failures. That has been true in the UK, that has been true mainly in Europe, although obviously geopolitical factors are important and they do play a role, especially in energy prices. And I'll show you a slide that shows what a roller coaster energy prices have been on since the 1970s. And when the lights go out or when we have energy disruptions, electricity shocks tend to be put right as quickly as possible because the economy is very dependent on electricity. Gas shocks tend to last a little longer, and oil shocks can last for months or years, as we saw since the 1970s. This is the way energy use and CO2 emissions are going, and you won't be able to see the detail. The detail are all the different regions of the world, and you can see that it's going upwards, that the rate of increase of CO2 emissions has increased, and the rate of increase of energy use. And this, of course, is largely driven by the emerging economies. The very large populations in Asia and Latin America, and to some extent Africa, that are now using much more like the levels of energy use that the industrial countries have been using for some time. So we go on there with the distinction between the OECD countries and the non-OECD, and you will see that since about 2000, the OECD countries are using about the same amount of energy, but the emerging economies and the non-OECD countries more generally are accelerating their increase in energy quite dramatically as their economies grow. And you can see how it's divided between energy transformation, that's basically electricity, industry, transport, residential, and other sectors, all the big sectors of energy use. So what the previous slide doesn't show is the enormous differences in the per capita use of energy by the different countries. So here we have a number of very high-consuming countries. So this is primary energy consumption, tons of oil equivalent per capita, mainly energy-producing countries, many of which subsidize the consumption of energy in their countries, with the result that they have very high per capita emissions. Here we have the major developed economies, with the United States and Australia as the big energy users, and then some of the European countries. You can see less than half the energy use per capita of the United States and Australia. Then we have the group of emerging economies, and we see South Africa, the People's Republic of China, and we see that they are more or less now the same per capita energy use as the European countries. And then that falls down, and then we have a group here of mainly South Asian and African countries that use very little energy per head of population indeed. And of course, that huge growth in energy use, which you saw on the previous slide, is because these countries, which used to use this amount of energy, are now using much more, and the populations of those countries are very large indeed. And the great majority of that energy is fossil fuels. So here we have coal, oil, and natural gas, these three big blocks of energy, relatively little nuclear, a certain amount of biofuels and waste and other renewables up here. And the challenge, of course, is that when we use these forms of energy, we get carbon emissions, and that is what is changing the climate. As an economist, of course, I'm very interested in prices, and prices are going to be critically important in giving the right signals about the way in which the energy system globally needs to develop. And you can see that the prices look like some kind of circus funfair ride. Here we have oil and coal, and here we have natural gas. And you can see that the oil price has gone on all over the place since the 1970s. This was just before the great financial crash, of course, 2008, when it fell here. And now, more recently, of course, if this had gone beyond 2011, you would see that the oil price was down, about down here again. Australian coal has tended to follow the oil price. The oil price has tended to be the price-setting fuel, although that is changing. And over here, we see natural gas, again, largely following the oil price, with these three very different markets, one in Japan, one in Europe, one in the United States. And here we have the United States shale oil and gas revolution, with the price in the United States falling to very low levels, while the prices in Europe and Japan stay high. So that's a very quick whistle-stop tour of some of the really big global trends that we witness. And another major trend is that electricity is becoming more important as an energy carrier in all different countries. So we see the OECD, we see the world, and we see the non-OECD countries, all of which are increasing the proportion of energy that they use, which is electricity. This diagram, which again has a lot of detail in it, comes from a paper which I and a colleague published in Nature earlier this year. So it's very recent. And you can see that although we talk about oil and gas, actually there are lots of different kinds of oil, and they are extracted at very different prices. So up the y-axis here we have the cost of oil. Along here we have the quantity of oil, and this is in thousands of billions of barrels. So that is a lot of oil. And here we have gas. Similarly, lots of different kinds of gas with a different cost curve. And here we have coal, rather fewer kinds of coal, but many, many, many tons of it. The unit here is zetajoules, which is 10 to the 15, I think. So that's a very large number indeed. And what this, which is the most important diagram as far as climate change is concerned, shows is that this little bar on the left is the amount of carbon which the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change thinks can be emitted into the atmosphere and still keep global temperature increases to below 2 degrees, or have a reasonable probability of doing that, which is the international objective. And this is the range. So the little light green, it could be, if we're unlucky, it could be the lower amount. If we're lucky, it could be the higher amount. But this is the amount, so it's about 1,000 gigatons of CO2. And this is the amount of carbon which we could emit into the atmosphere. The dark brown, if we were to burn all the reserves of oil, gas, coal, and lignite, and the light brown, if we were to burn all the resources that we know about. The difference between reserves and resources being that reserves are resources which are extractable with current technologies in currently an economically viable way. So obviously resources are much bigger than reserves, but ultimately they could easily be extracted because technologies to extract them improve the whole time. And you can see that the difference between the brown bars and the green bar is very great indeed. What are we doing at the moment? Well, more or less, we are burning fossil fuels along this kind of trajectory. This is gigatons. For those who are not mathematical, that's a billion, an American billion tons of CO2 every year. So we're at about 30, between 30 and 40, and we're going on the way up to 70 on our current trajectory. And the climate models suggest that that could lead to 4 or 5 degrees global warming. That's an average. It would be higher over land because the sea is cooler than the land. It would be higher in the upper latitudes, in the Arctic and the Antarctic, and that, of course, has huge implications for the amount of ice that will remain on the planet. What CO2 emissions need to do over the next few decades is adopt this trajectory if we are to keep global temperature increases to 2 degrees, which, as I said, is the international objective. So that is a challenge. I would say it is the defining challenge of the current time, and especially of your generation. What is the world doing with this challenge? Well, it's actually doing quite a lot. And I could give a 2-hour lecture on just this topic alone, but of course I won't. I'm just going to concentrate on the UN Framework Convention and the global negotiations, and then a bit on the EU. So the Framework Convention was signed in 1992 in the great enthusiasm around the Rio Earth Summit. And 5 years later, the Kyoto Protocol was negotiated and came into force a few years after that, where it divided the world into 2, the industrial countries called Annex I and the rest, and it gave targets to the industrial countries, and the non-Annex I countries were supposed to do something, but they didn't have any targets. And what happened was not much. A few countries met their targets. The European Union, by and large, met its target. Canada joined the Kyoto Protocol, but then clearly wasn't going to meet the target, so it left. And there were no problems, no sanctions with that. And as you've seen, global emissions, meanwhile, kept on rising at an accelerating rate. By 2009, it was clear that we needed a successor to the Kyoto Protocol, and it was also clear that the Kyoto Protocol hadn't been terribly successful. And it was also clear that the world had changed dramatically since 1992. And it didn't make any sense to divide the world into 2 kinds of countries, industrial countries and non-industrial countries, because many of the non-industrial countries, which were now called the emerging economies, were, as you will have seen, as big emitters, or in China's case, the biggest global emitter, and had per capita emissions that had caught up very much with some of the Annex I countries. So we got the Copenhagen Accord, which was intended to allow all countries to make voluntary commitments to emission reduction, called intended nationally determined contributions. You have to learn a completely different language if you go into the United Nations negotiations. It's full of these kinds of acronyms and particular things. The other really important thing that happened at Copenhagen was that all countries agreed that they were going to keep the temperature increase to 2 degrees centigrade. In the years since 1992, the Intergovernmental Panel had produced 4 more assessment reports, each of which was more worrying than the previous one in terms of the certainty that humans were causing climate change and in terms of the likely impacts of climate change if it was not kept to certain limits. And the limit that was chosen was the 2 degrees guardrail. Well, that was 2009. In 2010, this Copenhagen Accord was incorporated into the treaty, and most countries had started making these voluntary commitments. By 2011, it was recognized that there needed to be a new framework that went beyond Kyoto, that incorporated all countries with these commitments, if we were to have any chance to keep to the 2 degrees. And that brings us to how far are these commitments that countries have been making, how close do they come to keeping the temperature increase to 2 degrees? Well, we can see here, quite complicated diagram. This is the trajectory. You can see global CO2 emissions, we're now up here, and by 2010, this is the trajectory we're on, to 59 gigatons. This is the trajectory we will need to get to by 2020 if we are to keep it to a 66% chance of 2 degrees or a 50% chance of 2 degrees by 2030. So you can see that the commitments that have been made so far have not anything like closed this emissions gap. And that is what the current negotiations are all about for the Paris conference later this year in December, when it is intended that a new treaty will be signed that will come into force in 2020. And from talking to various people and going to various conferences and seminars, these seem to be the main issues that this new treaty will need to contain if it is to be effective. It will have to be a legal treaty. It will have to express continued commitment to the 2 degrees centigrade guardrail, although that will be very difficult to achieve now. It will have to be ambitious, more ambitious than the commitments that have so far been made. It will have to recognize that countries are at different stages of development and will therefore have to acknowledge that everyone needs to make their fair contribution. And you can imagine that in negotiating terms, agreeing what is a fair contribution is not going to be an easy thing. There will need to be rules, especially about monitoring, reporting, and verification, and there will need to be provisions for financial support from rich countries to poor countries to help the poorer countries adapt to climate change. That is an amazing agenda. The world community has never tried to agree something as ambitious as that. And it's only the seriousness of the issue of climate change that is bringing our countries together in order to try to do that for the first time. So this is a summary of where I think we've got to with the international negotiations. All countries need to be involved because it's a global problem. But developing countries will not accept emission control if they think it is going to harm their development. They've made that absolutely clear, so there's no point thinking about that any further. So committed industrial countries, and I've mentioned the UK and Korea there, but there are other countries, of course, that are doing just as much, will need to show that deep emission control is compatible with continued economic growth and development. And the phrases that have come to be used to express that hope, and it is still a hope, are the phrases green economy and green growth. And that's where I'm now spending the great majority of my own academic time, trying to work out what those terms mean, trying to work out whether in fact they are feasible, and particularly what kinds of policies at all levels might move global economies towards that. So let's move on then to the kinds of things that will need to happen in the energy system in order to decarbonize, and then we'll think about what the economic implications of that might be. Well, we start with energy demand, because that's what we want energy for. We want to satisfy our energy demands, our service demands, and we can have efficiency, we can change our lifestyles, we could use information technologies to control our use of energy to a much greater degree. We can redesign our electricity networks so that they are responsive to information technologies, and we can invent new demand technologies. I've mentioned here electric vehicles, heat pumps, there are fuel cells, there are energy storage technologies, an enormous array of possible technological developments, some of which I'm associated with in my own research, but all of which I try to understand how they are going. Once we've thought about the demand side, then we can think about what kinds of energy supply we may have. And the first priority is electricity. You saw from that slide that countries are using more and more electricity. That electricity needs to be decarbonized. And there are basically only 4 big options for decarbonizing electricity supply: large-scale renewables, small-scale renewables, nuclear power, and carbon capture and storage. All of those have great promise, but all of them are characterized by great uncertainty, and some of them with considerable problems. So countries react very differently, for example, to nuclear power. We've seen very different reactions in Japan following the Fukushima tragedy. We've seen very different reactions in Germany, which has decided to phase out its nuclear power stations, and compared to the UK, for example, which is just starting to build a new nuclear power station. So we can't expect a response from lots of different countries. Bioenergy is another big issue. Again, huge potential, but enormous controversies. There is only a certain amount of land there. There will be 9 billion people by 2050. 9 billion people will want to eat, and the land for bioenergy will compete with the land for food. So that's just one. Then there's the issues to do with biodiversity, which is very important. And then there are lots of social issues, because land obviously is very important for livelihoods, especially for livelihoods of poor people who may feel that they don't want to use their land to fill up the petrol tanks of people in the United States and Europe. And then we have globalization. Energy is increasingly a global commodity. Oil, of course, has been a global commodity for many years, but these technologies are increasingly global. Energy is increasingly traded, not just oil, but gas, of course, and potentially bioenergy, and even electricity within a continent like Europe. And that will lead to international integration. So whereas electricity used to be a national commodity, and we all had our national electricity supply networks, increasingly it's becoming a traded commodity, especially in a region like Europe. This is a diagram from this publication, which is a fascinating publication, which shows how these technologies are moving and developing. You can see there are lots of them there, and I'm not going to have time to go through all of them, but some are still at the stage of research and development, some are being demonstrated, and some are being deployed at scale. So research and development, and these are the electricity generation technologies. We've got solar PV, we've got nuclear. Then at the ones that are being demonstrated, we've got wind, offshore wind or marine smart grids. Down here we've got road transport and the various technologies for that. And here we've got the technologies for the built environment. You will know in many of your countries we're going through an urbanization revolution. You will know probably that 60% of the built environment that will exist in 2050 has not yet been built. It will be built between now and 2050, and how it is built will determine to a very large extent whether we come anywhere near the 2-degree CO2 emissions target or not. So this is the end of this part of the lecture. Different countries have different choices, and they will make different choices. These choices are political. You can find lots of industrial people and businessmen who say, oh no, this country needs this technology because that person happens to be selling that technology, but actually these are political choices that need to be taken politically, and they'll play out differently in terms of energy security and costs. You remember the other two parts of what I'm calling the energy trilemma. The economic and political consequences of making the wrong choices are enormous, as indeed are the consequences of failing to decarbonize. So this is a tough one. It's going to be difficult. The choices are difficult and important, and we need to be involved in them. There's a difficult balance between keeping our options open and going to scale, the importance of the demand side, and the importance of decarbonization. The Dean said in the introduction to this lecture that I spend quite a lot of my academic time on scenarios, and I do. Scenarios are a very important way of thinking about the future in a structured way that makes the assumptions explicit. And what we see here are a whole range of scenarios as to how the global energy system might develop by 2040 that have been produced by different bodies. Most importantly, perhaps, is the IEA, the International Energy Agency, with a 2-degree and a 4-degree scenario, and then a whole range of other bodies that have divided up their projections into different kinds of fuels, and you can see very different levels of energy use in those scenarios. This is another piece of work that is forthcoming in a book which will be published later this year. Again, quite complicated stuff and only illustrative of the kinds of scenario work that I and others get engaged in. So here we have different scenarios. This is a straight 2-degree scenario, assuming we meet the 2 degrees target. This is one where we don't allow the use of bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. This is one where the temperature increase goes to 3 degrees. And this is the reference scenario where we don't have any carbon control, and our model says that the temperature gets to 5 degrees. 5 degrees, of course, in my view, the prospects of having any human civilization at all at 5 degrees are pretty remote. So we can recognize that the 5-degree is likely to be an unpleasant world, and we've got to try to stop that happening. So I'm not going to go through these in any detail, but you can see that this is the decarbonization of the electricity system, and in the 2-degree scenario, this one, it happens very dramatically indeed. We have essentially zero carbon electricity. That's necessary in order to drive electric vehicles and in order to drive electric heating, because it's much easier to decarbonize electricity than it is to decarbonize petrol cars or gas burners. This is how energy use converges. So this is greenhouse gas emissions per capita. You remember I showed the very great differences in per capita CO2 emissions. Well, the high-emitting countries are going to have to come down quite dramatically. The middle-emitting countries will also have to come down. And the low-emitting countries, because they will be developing their economies in a low-carbon way, will fall even below what they are now. But the gap between the different countries is going to reduce enormously. So this is a huge policy challenge. And before I get on to the policy challenge, I'm just going to look at the Dean here and ask, we started a bit late, how much longer would you like me to talk for? 10 minutes is fine. Okay. Well, we're not going to be able to spend much time on policies because I want to talk a bit about economics, which is something that I'm supposed to know something about. So I'm really just going to concentrate, therefore, on this slide, because there was a very good publication, in my view, in 2007 by the economist Nicholas Stern, who's now Lord Stern, and he identified at the end of this very, very long study that there were basically 3 kinds of policy that the world will have to implement if we are to meet the climate challenge. The most important is carbon pricing, carbon taxes, carbon emission trading. A lot of my slides that I'm not going to show you in any detail deal with this subject. It's a subject that is now a global subject. So we know, for example, that China has 7 emission trading pilot schemes in different cities. We know that China has decided that it's going to have a single national emission trading scheme being developed over the course of the next year or two. And I just allow that to sink in. That is an extraordinary commitment for a country in China's development position to make. It will be an extremely difficult commitment to meet, but it shows the level of interest, commitment, and concern in China that there is to this issue of climate change. At the same time as we have carbon pricing, we need technology policy, low carbon energy sources of all sorts, high efficiency end-use appliances and buildings. This is this built infrastructure I'm talking about, the 60% of our cities that have yet to be built by 2050. And this will need a huge investment program for low carbon investments. And again, in many ways, China is leading the way. For the last few years, it's installed more renewable energy sources than any other country. It has led the photovoltaics revolution such that the price of photovoltaic panels has fallen by a factor of 10 over the last 20 or 30 years. And again, a quite remarkable achievement. And along with technology policy, we will have to change our behaviors. Many consumer behaviors that have evolved in Western countries are simply unsustainable, and they will come to an end. They will either come to an end because the societies that support them come to an end, or they will come to an end because we use our intelligence both to decarbonize supply and to use energy much more effectively and much more efficiently. And carbon pricing is so key because it helps both with the technology, the low carbon. If you make high carbon technologies more expensive, you incentivize low carbon, and they encourage people to adopt less carbon intensive lifestyles. So that's all I'm going to say about policy, which will mean you'll see a number of slides flashing before your eyes very fast, and you're welcome to go back and look at those in a minute. So here we go. This is the EU, what the EU is doing. I said there'd be a lot about taxes. There's emission trading. This is an interesting slide of the carbon price in the EU emissions trading scheme. So this is an awful warning to the Chinese. You don't want an emissions trading scheme that does this with your carbon prices, but it's not easy to design it so that it doesn't. You can see the carbon price has been almost as much of a roller coaster as the oil price. People thought it would be about up here when they introduced it. And you can see it started in phase 1 in 2005, and that was more or less where it was, and then it fell to the bottom there because there was no banking of permits, so they had no value after 2007. Well, everyone was expecting that. What they weren't expecting was this fall in the price in phase 2, which was caused, of course, by the global recession, where energy use in the EU fell by 10% very quickly. But you can see most recently the price has fallen without the cause of recession, simply because the politics of restricting the supply of emissions permits is very difficult. All countries want more permits to give to their industries because their industries lobby them very hard. And our political system has not been robust enough to resist that lobbying. I hope that the Chinese political system will be a bit more robust, because you need a carbon price that is quite a bit higher than this. Okay, so let's spend the last 5 minutes or so then on the economics of it. How much will it cost? This is the billion-dollar question, actually it's the trillion-dollar question. How much will it cost? And the way economists think about costs is in two ways, for those of you who aren't economists. There are the sums of money that we kind of understand, the money that we spend and that we buy things with from firms and all that stuff. And that's called microeconomics, the everyday economics. And then there's the impacts of all those millions of individual decisions at firm level and at consumer level, the impacts on the whole economy, which are called the macroeconomic consequences. And economists are basically interested in the macroeconomic consequences. We don't mind whether, as economists, we get our livelihoods from digging coal and oil out of the ground, or whether we get our livelihoods from solar-powered photovoltaics or wind turbines. What we want to know is what's the difference, the overall difference on the economy of switching from one to the other. And as with everything, many of you will have heard the old story that if you take 10 economists and put them in a room, you'll find 11 different opinions. Well, economists don't agree about this any more than they agree about most other things. So there are pessimists, and the pessimists have good reason for their pessimism. Fossil fuels are an extraordinary energy source, and moving away from them to higher cost alternatives is going to be difficult, and it could have a negative impact on economic growth. But the optimists have a lot of other arguments that they can put that suggest that either that impact will be relatively little, or it may, over time, even turn out that we will have a new industrial revolution based on low-carbon technologies. You will understand that that is a huge topic, and the one that occupies me now in most of my waking life, and I can't do it anything like justice now. In other presentations on just this area, I present evidence about how these technologies are developing and how they have developed, because I'm broadly in this camp. I believe we can do this, and I believe it doesn't have to be expensive, but we have to be intelligent. And we can explore that in some of the discussion if you want to. So, Nick Stern, in his Stern Review, came to this conclusion. That is a broadly optimistic conclusion. That by 2050, doing what we need to do to get the emissions on a downward trajectory, the cost is likely to be between 1% and 3% of GDP. And I'm going to, for those of you who aren't economists, I'm going to explain what that means, because we hear this the whole time in our newspapers, and most people haven't got a clue what it means. And it's actually quite important to understand what it means, because you can express this number in many different ways. 3% of GDP is quite a large number. The global economy is something like 27 trillion, and 3% of 27 trillion is many hundreds of billions. So if we talk about many hundreds of billions, then we'll think, oh, well, we can't possibly afford that. But we can also think of it in a different way, as in this graph. So what this graph shows us is that if we start in 2007, and the global economy is growing at 3% a year, which is kind of what it's done in the past, then we go up this red line, so that by 2030, we are 80% better off than we were in 2007. So this is this 80% increase in income, in the money in our pockets, over that period of time. If we grow in a low-carbon way, and if the cost is 3% of GDP, which is what Nick Stern concluded, and I'll show you why he concluded that in a minute, then instead of going up this red line, we go up the green line. So that by 2030, instead of being 80% better off, we're only 77% better off, and we have to wait one more year until we become as well off as we would have been in 2030. We have to wait until 2031, because the economy keeps growing at 3%. So that basically is the choice. If the 3% cost number is right, it means that instead of being 80% better off in 2030, we're going to have to wait until 2031. And that's the choice which our peoples have to make. You, me, our countries, our political systems. Where does this 3% number come from? Well, it comes from a whole heap of economic modeling, which is the kind of thing that I'm a bit involved in. Lots of different model runs that assume different levels of carbon reduction from the base, and that look at the effect on GDP. And you can see that the great majority of these model runs are between about a 1% below GDP and a 4% below GDP if we're going to get 70 or 80% reductions, which is what we need to get. So the best kind of thinking about the future suggests that that's going to be the cost. But that assumes that there aren't going to be any costs from climate change. Well, if I believed there weren't going to be any costs from climate change, then I wouldn't be in this business. I'd be playing golf on the golf course or something by now. It's because I believe there are going to be costs from climate change. And the interesting thing about these runs is that they assume that the baselines have no costs from climate change. And the only model that I know that has assumed that there will be costs if we do nothing is one that the United Nations Environment Program ran in their Green Economy report from 2011, where we had different baselines here, and you see that the green scenario, the one that we do, where we do tackle climate change, ends up being the high growth scenario for the future because of the costs of not treating natural capital seriously as we go forward into the future. So this is the green growth line, and really trying to get more insights into that is where my academic work is focused. And I've got 2 or 3 more slides now just to conclude. So, the GDP costs are relatively low. All the evidence suggests that. The costs are very low compared to expenditures on health and insurance against risk. If I want to insure my house in the UK against fire, and anyone who owns a house always does insure their house against fire, it costs me about 150 quid a year, 150 pounds a year, about 200 euros. That is roughly what I will be paying as a UK consumer in order to decarbonize the UK economy. It's roughly the same. There is a 0.02% probability that my house will burn down, and yet I will pay that because I don't want to take that risk of not having a house. There is a 95% probability that we're on track for dangerous climate change, according to the climate scientists. I leave it to you to wonder whether it's worth paying that sort of amount as insurance against an event that we would much rather didn't happen. If we take account that health co-benefits, the fact that coal is absolutely filthy stuff, apart from what it does to the atmosphere, what it does to the air pollution locally. I spend a lot of time in China, very happy to be in China, but I'm not happy to breathe China's air, and I suspect many Chinese people are not happy to breathe China's air in its cities either. China will clear that up because other countries have cleaned it up, but it has an enormous opportunity to clean it up in a low-carbon way, which is not how we did it in the US and Europe. So there's an enormous challenge, and that, of course, is another huge benefit of decarbonization. Fossil fuel importing countries will be much better off, of course, and the development of renewables, and I haven't shown you some slides, which are in another slide set I have, of how the cost of renewables has come down in recent years. The development of renewables promises effectively free electricity going forward into the future. We've got to get those technologies, we've got to crack those technologies, but we've made enormous progress. And once we've cracked them, just imagine what that gift to future generations is. Technologies that can give us electricity that is infinite and free. Almost infinite. Lasts forever, anyway. So, why is this so difficult politically? And it is difficult politically. If you follow the climate negotiations, you will find that the arguments are enormous. Well, because governments have to get involved in this. Markets don't see carbon by themselves. Markets don't see pollution by themselves. We need government. And some people, especially in the United States, and especially the Republican Party in the United States, has a big problem with anything that needs government. So we have this huge division between the Republicans and the Democrats in the US, such that an extraordinarily technologically advanced country is denying some of the best established science that has ever been done, much of it done by American scientists. So we have an extraordinary situation there, which I'd love to discuss if any of you are up for it. Then we get large-scale investments. These investments are eye-wateringly large, and they have to be incentivized from the private sector. Governments can't do this by themselves, and the private sector is only going to invest if it can make profits. We have to create markets that will make profits for private investors to go low carbon. That requires carbon pricing. It also requires a shift from consumption to investment. We don't call ourselves a consumer society for nothing. We love consuming, and we're not so good at investing. And we consume in the UK about 90% of what we produce, and we invest about 10% of what we produce. In China, interestingly, they consume about 60% of what they produce, and they invest 40%, which is one of the reasons why their economy grows so fast. We did that in the UK in Victorian times, and we need to start thinking about doing that again in order to shift the infrastructure of our economy, but that means consuming less. It doesn't mean lower GDP, because investment supports GDP as much as consumption does. Need for higher savings and lower consumption, and the need for rising carbon prices, and we love doing things that are very carbon intensive. We love driving cars, we love flying all over the world, all these things which produce carbon emissions. If carbon prices go up, we will do less of those, probably lots less of them, and that is a very big social change which many of us don't want. So that's why it's politically difficult. And this is the last slide for today. It's not technology or cost that are the main constraining factors to the climate problem, but politics. People's attachment to consumption rather than savings, and to high carbon lifestyles. And that causes this to be politically very difficult. People don't vote for it. And in countries where they don't have elections, governments don't legislate for it. We've got to change this political reality if we want to mitigate climate change and if we want to avoid the huge uncertainties of entering a climatic regime which humans have never experienced. We know what the Earth used to be like from ice cores in the Antarctic. We know that the atmosphere has been very much warmer in the past than it is now, but humans didn't exist then because this was hundreds of millions of years ago, and humans have existed with a very narrow range of climatic variation, a range that has allowed us to develop agriculture so we can feed very large numbers of people and develop human civilizations. I want to keep that. Thanks.